This video will take a look at the music video for Dizzy Rascal's Dream as part of Eduqas Media A-Level Component 1 Section A. I thought as a useful starting point it might be helpful to look at some possible questions you could get asked. It's important to note here that these are all 15 markers and therefore a single question about Dream. But you could equally get Dream as part of the comparison question in Section A, where you would be required to compare it to an unseen text, in which case that would become a 30 marker. But a representation question might look like, how do the representations in Dream express viewpoints and ideologies, for 15 marks? How do music videos use media language to construct meaning? Refer to Dream in your answer, a 15-mark question. The third one I put here, you're unlikely to get a question which is framed in this particular way, but I thought it was important to point out and for you to remember that context is crucial when analysing these texts for meaning or for representations anyway. Your ability to analyse the extent to which representations reflect or challenge the contexts in which they are set or produced is always going to be an important element of Component 1 Section A. As I did with Riptide, just a reminder of some of the generic codes and conventions that you might think about when analysing a music video, whether that's one of your set texts or whether it's an unseen music video in the exam. The way in which the narrative is structured is something you can always take a look at, and there you'll be applying Todorov's theory, of course. Intertextuality doesn't always come up, but it's particularly relevant to the video we're looking at here. Image and text cohesion, the way in which images and lyrics combine to create meaning, is always going to be something that's relevant to a music video. And motifs, repeated images throughout a text, are often relevant, and they certainly are with Dizzy Rascal's music video. Let's start with Todorov then. And Todorov's notion is that all narratives move from one state of equilibrium to another, that those equilibriums are separated by a period of imbalance or disruption. And crucially with Todorov, and this is the most important point to his theory, the way in which the narrative is resolved has ideological significance. So the way in which the equilibrium is re-established at the end is important for determining the meaning of that particular text, and it certainly is here. So let's have a think about the narrative structure of this video. We start with Dizzy coming out of the music box at the beginning. Then we have a number of disruptions. The main disruption, though, appears to be his music and his music career. So it's a positive disruption. And then the re-established equilibrium sees Dizzy getting back into the music box at the end. Well, the music box at the start, him coming out of there, could be seen as an equilibrium of repression of black people, perhaps, or black young black culture. He's imprisoned in some way, isn't he, at the start of this video? But he frees himself, and increasingly the disruption of his music career becomes a narrative of empowerment and a narrative of freedom and a narrative of self-realization. It's interesting then that Dizzy gets back into that same box at the end. It's up to you how you read this. You can either read this as a message about the continued repression of young black culture in the UK, and with that would come a message that there is still work to be done. Or you could read it that this is a change, because this is Dizzy getting back into the box on his own terms. At the start of the video, he is reliant on somebody releasing him. At the end of the video, Dizzy is controlling things to a much greater extent, and therefore the resolution becomes one of self-reliance and one of a progressive view of black youth culture. I'm going to take a look at the representation now of a number of different social groups, and we'll start with representation of the white middle classes. We have the obvious intertextual reference to 1950s children's television. We're set in this 1950s living room, and we have a clear reference throughout to 1950s television, and particularly Muffin the Mule. The 1950s is an appropriate setting for Dizzy to use because that is the era of the Windrush generation, of course, when Britain starts to see an influx of people from other areas of the world, particularly the Asian subcontinent and also the Caribbean, on a scale which Britain hadn't seen for quite some time, if ever. And the judgmental expressions that we see are perhaps typical of the judgment that was fired at people of ethnicity when they arrived in the UK in the 1950s. But Dizzy uses these not to empower the white middle classes, but perhaps to be critical of them, because even though the character we have here is judgmental at the start of the video, once Dizzy becomes mainstream, she is much more accepting, and therefore we get a message of hypocrisy. The white middle classes are being represented in a hypocritical light because as soon as Dizzy or black youth culture becomes mainstream, it becomes acceptable to them. Now on to representation of black and youth culture. Again, we have the intertextual reference. This time it's through the use of puppets. Now, puppets are appropriate because puppets are controlled by a higher power or a puppet master. And here we have the idea that black youth culture is being controlled in some way. Controlled by authority, for certain, but also perhaps crucially controlled by the media, manipulated by the media. Representations of black youth culture have been repeated over time in order to construct what we see here, this rebellious, unlawful representation through the graffiti and through the images of stealing. But those representations become much more progressive as we go through the video. We have the reference to the baby mothers and the baby fathers, breaking down expectations of youth culture. We have the long shot, the isolated long shot of the character at the top there, engaging in breakdance, taking ownership of his own identity. And as I said before, we get Dizzy going back into the box on his own terms at the end. Therefore, it becomes a much more progressive, empowering representation of black and youth culture by the end of the video. And that's very much part of the message of Dream, is breaking down those old stereotypes, but not dismissing them. Those stereotypes exist, they are real, but Dizzy is changing the perception of them and taking ownership of them to show that they are much more positive in their own right than the white controlled media might have had us believe through the representations of the past. The representation of the police is a really, really interesting one. Another intertextual reference here, we get to Punch and Judy. Punch and Judy is a British institution seen generally at seasides and fairgrounds through the 30s, 40s, 50s, but even into the present day. And Punch and Judy, of course, is centred in white patriarchal culture. We get a man, Punch, who actually in some ways is quite abusive of his wife. And so the intertextual reference works as a criticism of white policing of black youth culture in the 1980s and 90s. It is one of white patriarchal control seeking to establish and maintain inequalities of power. It is also one that was abusive and violent, as seen in the video when the policeman is beating the black youths. And Dizzy has taken the opportunity through that intertextual reference to mock the police in some way and break down those inequalities of power that the police were perhaps seeking to establish in the 1980s. We also get the idea that the police are being represented as hypocrites again, because as soon as Dizzy says I was everywhere and therefore he's become mainstream, and that ties in with the image in the top right hand corner, the police goes from a position of being excluded behind the window to a position of dancing along with the black youths, wanting to be part of that culture as soon as it becomes mainstream. So the police go from being violent and critical to becoming hypocritical later in the video. In doing so, Dizzy demeans the significance of the police and promotes his own importance and significance instead. Paul Gilroy is an interesting theorist to look at here in reference to Dream. Gilroy's argument is that colonial discourses continue to inform attitudes in the post-colonial era. Civilization constructs racial hierarchies and sets up binary oppositions based on otherness. Well, we certainly have the construction of the binary of two different worlds here. We have the 1950s living room of the white middle class, and we have the urban streets of the world of black youth culture. So the binary is established, but it's not established to maintain inequalities of power, as Gilroy would argue. Instead, it's used to elevate black youth culture and criticise white middle class judgment. So this text very much challenges Gilroy's notion of representation, and it does that because Dizzy, to a large extent, is in control of the representations here. Gilroy's theory applies most strongly when we have the white patriarchal media constructing representations for us, but in this case Dizzy is controlling the representations, and that's why they don't follow Gilroy's theories of colonial discourses, because this isn't a colonial discourse. This is a discourse constructed by black identity for black identity. And that links in with the lyrics that we see at the bottom. The more challenging it got, the more I fought it. You can go far if you put your mind to it. You'll find the way you are, just do what you feel. This is about owning your own identity, constructing it for yourself, because that is exactly what Dizzy is doing. He's fighting the system in which he's working. And that brings us on to David Gauntlett's ideas of representations, his notion that the modern media gives us a broader range of representations from which we might construct our own identities. Dizzy, interestingly, doesn't shy away from the representations of the past. He uses them, but he takes ownership of them in order to empower them. And so what this video does is gives black viewers in particular, or young black viewers in particular, a representation of black identity which is progressive, which is empowered, and which is full of hope. A representation which was missing from the media of the past. So Dizzy is giving those watching an opportunity to either construct or reinforce an identity which the media of the past had told them was wrong, or was an outsider, or was unlawful. He's breaking down those very ideas here. And we'll finish with a look at a media language theorist in Roland Barthes, the idea that texts are made up through a process of signification. So we get a series of signs, signifiers, and then we get the signified meaning that is attached to them. And Barthes says there is a level of connotation which involves the meanings associated with or suggested by the sign. And those meanings are determined by the context in which they are received and by the context of the viewer. So signs and symbols don't always have the same meaning. It will depend on who is looking at that sign or symbol. And then crucially, the idea that constructed meanings can come to seem self-evident, achieving the status of myth through a process of naturalization. What Barthes is saying here is, if these signs and symbols are used in the same way over and over again, their meanings become common sense, achieving the status of myth, as he says. Well, let's consider three of the symbols in this video. The hoodie, first of all, that Dizzy is wearing, the red hoodie. Well, through representations that have been repeated over time, and here you might consider a theorist like Gerbner as well, that symbol has been constructed by the mainstream media as one of rebellion, as one of something that is unlawful, something that is unwelcome, something that is to be shunned. Graffiti, similarly, through representations over time, has been naturalized as a symbol of rebellion and a symbol of something unlawful. Meanwhile, the police or a policeman, through representations over time, has become a symbol that we are taught to trust and respect. So what Dizzy is doing here is taking these myths that have been established through repeated representation over time or through naturalization and breaking them all down. He takes ownership of the hoodie as an identity and turns it into something positive and progressive. He takes graffiti and reminds us that yes, it is an act of rebellion, but not necessarily something that is unlawful. And he takes the symbol of the police and reminds us that trusting them implicitly is not necessarily the way to go, depending on the viewer. Depending on your own experience with the police determines how you view that particular symbol. It doesn't mean the same thing to everyone. The viewer or the experience's context is crucial in determining the meaning of that particular symbol.